Hi guys, so today I'm going to give you translating UX research into stories. So if you saw like always part, then this is probably like the second part to that. So in translating UX research into stories, the reason why it's very important is because no matter how great your methodology is, like no matter how very spick and span, everything to the letter, following all the standards, if you don't, if you're not able to communicate them properly in a way that it's digestible, then the way that anyone else can understand and empathize with the user, then it's not going to really go far in terms of effectivity from drawing research into the design part. And if you don't document it for longevity purposes, then for one reason or another, whoever will take up the next part of it, either because you're no longer working on the project, let's say you're in corporate, or for example, you work in a startup or like a freelance project, then it will eventually like fade away. So the UX research that you've done over the course of the months, all your findings and stuff like that, it will only exist for as long as you remember it. That's what's going to happen if you don't go into documentation side. And the memory of this only exists like with you, and this is something that you're gonna have to really deal with, and you have learned to go through since, especially if you're passing on a project to someone, documenting it properly and translating the research properly really helps, I guess, like communicate what you also went through in the research. And then ultimately, it also helps solve any disjointed understandings between the research and the design. So, especially if the UX researchers and the UX designers are not the same person, for example, so especially in like larger workspaces or something like that, then handing these over or like collaborating on these things will be a lot easier, a lot faster, if you're able to document and translate the research properly, in such a way that you have like the same understanding and same onboarding to the idea. And the keyword actually is that it's not just communication, also documentation, but translating is bridging the research to the empathy that translates into design. So just to note, though translating is kind of pretty much part of UX research, when we say that, like in this context, it's like, for example, you have all your methodology laid out, you have all of your findings put together, but then if it's not collated in such a way that is well documented and like visualized and stuff like that, then it might just stay as it is, just like a group of like files inside one Google Drive or something like that. So the standard order, not even standard order, but like the list of the different ways of translating from the research into like the UX research part, like into the stories part, we have like a whole list. So if you see here, there's affinity map, personas, journey maps first. So affinity maps basically serve as the onboarder of the mind setting. So imagine your team broke off into groups of two to do who is the interviewee, who is a note taker, and you interview like maybe like 5, 8, 20, etc., people. How do you put these all together in a way that all of you guys will understand? So affinity mappings, I'll actually show you something here. So affinity mapping kind of ends up looking like this. So affinity mapping, basically from all the different groups of interviews and stuff like that, you place like the important details of important information into a set of sticky notes. So in this case, it's this one. So this one is the set of sticky notes here. So the reason why it's different colors is either because maybe they have different kinds of user groups. Maybe for example, one is uses e-commerce shops, the other one doesn't, something like that. Or if you want to have any other ways of categorizing like the insights, since it gives a bit more context when you put it together. So basically all you have to do for this one is you just make sure that everyone has their own assignments into like the different kinds of interviews, and through this you get to place into the different post-its. You have a lot of stuff here, and what you're going to then ask of them is that everyone has to mix it all up. So for example, you try to make sure that it's very mixed. No 5 post-its or no 2 post-its of the same interview are close together, and everyone now gets to basically arrange it into a categories. So from this one, since it looks like this, you tell them, okay, guys, let's arrange it into categories. Feel free to arrange it however way you like. Let's work together, collaborate. So in this case, what happens is that they're putting stuff together and they're like, oh, I think this one goes there, or they go like, oh, maybe this one should go here instead. What do you think? And that in a way is already serves as a means of collaboration. This is why affinity mapping is onboarding to the idea. So there's usually two sets I would suggest doing. Like the first set is like the general kinds of categories. So for example, in this case, it's like what you look for, there's motivations, pain points, study habits, stuff like that. And then you ask them, okay, let's break this down even further. So from this one, so if you see what you look for in a course, for example, it then becomes description overview, course content, and then even like further down, like what is it about the overview of the course and stuff like that. Motivation, for example, they're able to cluster it further inside into to know more, school, work, things like that. So by doing this twice, not only are you segmenting it further to make it easier to translate into, let's say, paragraphs, something like that, but when you finish this and you put these together and your team is like, okay, let's talk about what we found out. So you go through each of these. So from what used to be like a disjointed, it's actually like a visual representation of what your team is like before affinity mapping. You now have like this one. So by the time you're done going through the whole of this, all of you guys have a shared understanding of what you're working with and the context of everyone else's interviews, which is really, really awesome. So next one is personas. So personas are basically tangible representations of the users. Just a note, the persona should not be like the by all and all set of like users. Of course, like the users themselves, user groups are very complex groups of people. No one persona is the 100% perfect representation. But to have a persona serve as some sort of benchmark and guide for the most of it is still extremely much more helpful than having none. So um, the personas in this case, there's different ways to kind of structure it together. Some people use pictures, some people use, other different things. So in this case, what we did is the personas here. So the personas here, um, if you see here, there's like a template, but honestly, there's very various different ways to set up a persona. So some people use images instead, some people prefer illustrations. But of course, if using images, make sure it's like royalty free or you have like the consent of the person who has the picture there. Just basic stuff about personas. Just make sure that you have like the name, like the mock name, or if not like a full name, there may be something like a title. So for example, let's say like deal driven Danny or trust driven like Tristan or something like that. So by doing so like this, so you have the name here. You can also have brief information like the age, occupation, where they live, as well as a biography. So biography is basically the same as what you'd say as a biography of people. So this person wakes up every morning, they do this, they also live with their family who does a lot of this, does a lot of that, and every day they think blah 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 blah. So there's a very lot of different ways to do a biography. There's also personality. So are they more like an extrovert, introvert? Following the MBTI, but of course you shouldn't be limited to just that kind. And then the super important parts to have in a persona, I would say, is the wants and needs, the motivations, and the frustrations, a quote, and I'd say descriptors. So the wants and needs, these are basically what you find out from the affinity maps. Like, okay, like there's two kinds of sets of personas. We found out that after all these interviews, you can kind of cluster them into two main groups. And this group, their wants and needs are maybe more towards this one. So let's say their wants and needs are more into like finding the best deal, knowing the prices, the promo codes, maybe get stuff like that. And they're motivated by getting like the best deal for what they have, saving money. And for example, frustrations can be like, oh, they can't see like the breakdown of what they're spending for, or it's difficult to navigate through the app or anything like that. So navigating through the app or navigating through apps, for example, like e-commerce apps, stuff like that, whatever. So these are super important. The quote is just like a representation of what they would say. So usually it's very relevant to their situation, their biography. So in the case of the person who is value driven, they maybe say, oh, I really wish I could find something that's worth, like, buying, that is blank, or maybe, there's a lot of different ways. It's usually something that you find recurring across like the user group inside the interviews. And the reason why these are super important, like most important, I'd say, is motivation, wants and needs, and frustrations, because these are actually really what you look for as like UX researchers and what UX designers hope to either aid, alleviate, or to solve. So their frustrations, like, oh, I have such a hard time checking out maybe of like different kinds of platforms. It'd be great if it'd be easier. Then of course the UX designer are the kind of has an idea of what they might be able to do later on, but only if they find out like, okay, yeah, it's a recurring frustration across these kinds of users. While of course motivations and wants and needs kind of reflect off of each other. So being able to know these and being able to translate them into this one card is really helpful. So just note, all the templates I'm showing you right now are the ones I have personally used or have been using with other teams, but I will show you UX UINI's templates afterwards. So the same goes for this one as for the other one. The last one is study relevant sections. These are basically sections that are relevant to what you're studying. So in this case, it was a study concerning like careers and stuff like that. So that's why a part of this is career. So currently they use, for example, Jago, JNT, stuff like that. In other contexts, maybe you'd want to put like the social medias that they use or like streaming platforms, things like that. So it's like kind of things to remember, that like who or what did they already use right now as either some purpose of reference or understanding of why they choose it, since it kind of reflects sometimes to their motivations and wants and needs. And then the next one is journey maps. So journey maps, I wouldn't say full sensory, but like a large sensory walkthrough experience of what the user is going through. And they're extremely important for us, because journey maps are relevant whether or not you have already an app designed or made. Because, okay, if you think about it, show the user journeys. They're basically a representation of like what they experience, so what they go through, and ultimately that's something that people like the researchers and designers need to know. I wouldn't say the most, but like a very big part, they really want to be able to solve that. So in this case, there are several parts of a user journey, but again, all the templates here only placeholder templates. There's a lot of templates out there. You can even make your own. I have used Google Sheets as a template for user journeys before. I have also done this by hand on paper. So don't be limited as long as it, I guess, like properly represents and properly shows what's going on, then it serves its purpose. So for example, the user journey, it's usually really comes after personas because it's really helpful to make a user journey with a persona in mind. So you find, okay, we have two groups of personas. So knowing these two groups of personas already, you already have an idea of like the user journey that goes through the two different personas, since they have two different experiences because they have two sets of, I wouldn't say it's incompletely, but like they have to an extent a different experience, motivations, frustrations, goals, etc. So, for example, here there's a persona. There's also the scenario. So the scenario is basically what is the situation for why they're doing this. So a scenario I've used before is basically now it's like the gift giving season. You have to buy something for three of your friends, so you end up using this thing or going onto platforms to buy stuff for them. So let's say that's the scenario. So you can already picture or kind of imagine, or even from like the interviews themselves, like insert how they do so or how they do these things. But of course, it can be more generic, like, oh, you have to book a delivery through an app. You have to book like a set of deliveries from an app during rush hour or something like that. So those are basically scenarios. They basically lay the ground for what is the beginning and what is the end of the user journey. While goals and expectations are, of course, like what do they expect? I guess based on prior experience, what are goals, what do they aim to accomplish as a person? So I aim to finish booking all these safe and sound in a span of 20 minutes. Or for example, I expect that I will have a hard time having to check out over and over again, maybe things like that. And when it comes to the faces are basically what goes on. So you'd like there's some phases that kind of are longer. Like you'd want to have like a group them into two, while a lot of phases are just like one thing, one thing, one thing. So I did this thing, and then this thing happens, whatever. So actions in this case are basically things that they have done in that situation. So let's say booking, so opening the app, going through the different details, stuff like that. Those are examples of actions, things that they have done in that specific phase. Thoughts, as we know, is what are they thinking at the time? So doing versus thinking. So what are they thinking? Like, oh, like I wish this could be faster, things like that. While the emotions reflect, I guess, what you have in actions and thoughts already by then. So how, like, for example, the middle line is obviously neutrality, so no positive or negative feelings, and then it just gauges up and down depending on how intensely they feel positively or how intensely they feel negatively. While pain points is just a list of like things of like depending on already the actions and the thoughts, what are the pain points concerning there? So pain points, so let's say like difficulty doing several payments like over and over, difficulty booking, things like that. And opportunities are basically looking at your pain points, what can you get out of it, or what can you see as an opportunity to design or to consider as a feature from here. So it's just, a way to reflect on it. So again, since you probably have two user groups, maybe you have more than one, you maybe even have just one, that's perfectly fine. Then you'll have more than one user journey here. So next one, we have job stories. So job stories, they basically follow a specific format. So job stories, I don't really have like a template for it, but obviously you can talk about it together. You can even have post-its for it. Job stories basically trigger the why of what they're doing and what they should be able to accomplish. So for example, the job story is like a user story. When blank, I want to blank. So I'm going to actually write it here just so we remember it. So when blank, I want to blank. So I can blank. Okay, so when a situation happens, I want to the motivation. So I can have the expected outcome. So what are examples of like job stories? So job stories examples. Let's see, like job stories that we have. There's other examples of like this kind of layout though. So aside from when blank, I want to blank, so I can blank. There's also so actually I'll lay it down here. So this is situation, and I want to like motivation, and so I can have expected outcome. But then there's another one. So aside from this one, you also have has a persona. I want to action so that expected outcome. So the recurring one here really is the expected outcome part, because ultimately they want to be able to do something by the end of what they're going through, and that's ultimately what you want to bring them to. So for job stories, as for kind of like some examples. So for example, when an order is submitted, or when searching by postal code, when no matches are found, when looking at recent orders. So let's say you're having food. So when it's dinner time tonight, I want to have pizza so I can easily feed my friends. So it's not that intense, but you can see how each thing relates to the other. So that was actually for job stories. So it really gives you a picture of like the user and their intentions, which is basically a statement that guides design that is cultivated by research. So even if it's just one statement, without much good research, then you won't be able to reach a conclusive statement that really guides the design. So next up, we have how might we. So how might we's are very open-ended, very collaborative means of ideation, which encourages discussion between you and your team, your group, and even like any of your stakeholders. So even if you're a freelancer, you can even ask your, I guess like your client to join in to your how might we's, so that they kind of understand what's happening. So for how might we's, we have here. So how might we's, there's also something very collaborative in nature. So let's say you already have like this understanding that job stories, you have like the user journeys, personas, etc., etc. Like you can already kind of think about what are the things you have to touch on as a researcher or a designer. So these big blocks are basically where you put your how might we. So let's pretend that these darker ones aren't there. So let's say, oh, how might we make like how might we set up a dashboard intuitive for careers, or um, how might we bring um, examples of how might we's. Yeah, so there's a lot of a lot of examples. So even for example, like, oh, how might we design with the people relying on data in mind, or how might we design with people with a certain kind of disability in mind? For example, if it's, of course, like relevant to any, but especially if it's, for example, relevant to specifically what you are making. So if you're making, for example, an app that's geared to the blind, then of course you should be thinking about how might we cover, or how might we design this such that it's geared towards them or something like that, especially if it's a specific thing in mind, like a disability or like a language or anything like that. So these kinds of things that pop up to you as you go through different researches, as you go through the different stuff I just mentioned just now. So you lay them out in the different big boxes here, and then as a group, you kind of go through each one and you kind of list them down together. So, okay, guys, so how might we do this one? So right, everyone has a chance to say something. They can even just copy paste the post-it and just write it on their own. And you just go through each and every one here until you're done. So let's say you're already done here. You've finished everything here. So what happens next? So How My Piece, as we say, is the open-ended collaboration. It's a means of ideation and encouraging discussion among all of you guys. And the most important handoff of How My Piece is the feature matrix. So the feature matrix, it really works hand in hand with the stakeholders, so especially developers, to see not only the impact, but also feasibility. So when you say, let's see this one. So let's say the feature matrix here, then this kind of what it looks like in the end. So you have your how might be's, right, from a while ago. You have your sets of possible solutions for stuff there. So they're probably like features, probably like more nitpicky stuff. Then you can look at a feature prioritization matrix. So this one I use. So basically, how complex is it to implement from the highest to lowest. So low complexity is more on the okay side. And finally, the business to customer value. So how much of an impact does it make to the users? So low is in the low part, and then there's high. So the higher the impact and the easier the feasibility, then the higher the placing it is in here. So it goes up into the upper right. So everything that's in the green. So basically what happens is you have your developers maybe, or you should onboard developers even if they're not part of your team. And you kind of talk about, okay, so I have this thing. It's very high impact, but can you tell me like how feasible it is for you, especially if you're like a developer? And then you'd be like, oh, I think it's super easy. Just put in the green. So let's say low to high. You're like, okay, this one is pretty high priority. We feel like it's here. And then they're like, okay, it's super easy to implement, don't worry about it. So it goes all the way here. So the same thing just goes over and over again. So you understand the impact it has, and you're like, oh no, it's really, let's say, oh, this impact, it's not gonna make that much big of an impact, so it's probably somewhere here. You're like, oh yeah, that's too hard to make, it's too hard to implement. So it ends up going to the red. So it's really a way to guide your decision making in a very objective but collaborative manner. So high impact, easy feasibility, something like that, then go do it, implement it. And if it's like kind of high impact but kind of difficult, or for example low impact but very easy to implement, that might fall into the yellow ones. And then lastly, if it's a low impact and also extremely hard to implement, then don't even think about pursuing it. So after you lay all of these out, so these are actually the boxes you had from here. What happens? Like you have the stuff on the yellow, the four considerations. Like, okay, what do I do with this? So go through when you finish all the different yellow ones, and then consider, talk about with your team, like if you really want to keep it or not. Or if, for example, maybe we can keep this, but set it aside for maybe a different phase or a later phase when we can validate if it's something we really want to keep. So basically go through each one. In this case, we tagged it green, for example, or red. Like red, if it's like, no, like I shall not do it anymore. Green, okay, we can implement this. We think it's something worth having. And lastly, orange, if we're kind of like, we were kind of just considering it, or like maybe just revisit it in the future, maybe we can have this later on. So feature prioritization matrix, definitely do this as a team, definitely have developers involved, and you can even have your stakeholders involved as well. So that is for feature matrix. So doing these are very important. So when to do what? establishing or renewing a perspective on users. So, especially for example, you're working freelance or something like that, it's incredibly important to know um, who are your users. So, especially if you're freelance, let's say you don't have any you don't have any design, you're starting from scratch, then definitely you're going to go to the different UX research methodologies that Owe mentioned, and eventually you're going to want to make these kinds of things to be able to communicate that effectively, not just to your your client, your boss, but also to your teammates, to have a shared vision of what you're doing. So especially if you have well, if you don't have any prior design, or for example you come into a team and you realize, okay, guys, we got like a research, right? And they're like, oh yeah, research, like we did that like in 2017. It's like, oh no, okay, we have to do that over, we have to do it again because we're sure the users of that year are not anywhere near the same as what we have now. So you do it again, but what you do now is you're going to do documentation. So yeah, in that case, you have a lot to work with, and being able to translate these kinds of research into stories, to the personas, the job stories, the user journeys, the how might we, some feature matrix. You already have like a shared vision ready as a set of UX designers as to what you should be watching over and what you should be doing next. So um, yeah, generally it's really why it's really important to be translating your research into these kinds of methods. And as I said, though I showed you several templates, those are the ones that I work with, but UX Uni, for example, has their own. So we're going to get there in a bit. We're actually going to show it now. So this one I actually have. So there's a UX Uni research canvas. The one that they have, the canvas here, is basically like a way to see the meeting the problem. So identifying your problem, who are the possible stakeholders, planning your research. So it's actually in tie-in with what OWAY teaches you. So research objectives, you have research participants, you also have research methods. So just laying these out, this entire canvas really helps your team know what you're going to be doing next, like who are we interviewing, what are we doing, and connecting the dots. So there's key takeaways, there's user personas, and there's a summary, like what is your solution. So it's a great canvas that they laid out for you guys. So it's a very great way to kind of just compile things together, and also serves as a great documentation. They have personas here. So they have like the image, the demographics I mentioned. Let's say it's also kind of like biography. They have characteristics, so what kind of person are they, the adjectives, the name of the persona type. So persona type is like maybe like, oh, they're like a small business owner, something like that. And you also have here laid out like the goals, motivations, frustrations, which I did mention was some of the most important parts of it. But again, just like in what I had here, you can opt to have other things. So you can opt to have a quote. You can also opt to have study relevant sections, like the social media that they use, if it's relevant, etc., etc. They also have here the user journey. So just like what I had here, they had the persona name, had your scenario, you have your expectations, and also the opportunities. So the opportunities are laid up here, but of course you can also have it down there if it's easier for you. And again, don't be limited to using these templates. You're actually even free to choose like or use like Google Sheets or something like that if it makes it easier for you. And for example, here again, activity, what they do, goals. So there's all different kinds of templates when it comes to personas and user journeys. So for example, mine just goes into action, thoughts, emotions, pain points, opportunities, while theirs goes into activity, goals, potential touch points, and experience. So feel free to search up or feel free to make your own, whichever you feel communicates the easiest for you. And they also have a prioritization map here as well. It looks quite different to mine, but again, it's the same thing. So must have, should have, won't have, could have. So to what extent is something on one side and to what extent is something on the other side. But ultimately, what you get for the same thing for both is understanding which is something you definitely need and which are the ones that you don't actually need as much. And then they also have other stuff here. So sample works, again, you can check this here if you'd like to be guided by anything. So here, the meeting the problem, planning your research, and connecting the dots. And here's an example of a filled up persona. So these are great to work together, especially if you're using Figma. And you even have an empathy map here. So we didn't really get to touch on it a while ago, but empathy map basically collates the sensory experience of the user. So what do they say? What do they do? What do they think? But also what do they feel? So what do they feel in that moment? So these are very relevant if you really want another extra, I guess, to really fully understand and empathize with your user. And lastly, this is also an example of what they have. So won't have, so not exactly something relevant. Should have, things that you should definitely keep. Must haves, and then could have. So there's a lot of different kinds of stuff out there that you can use in terms of like templates. And basically, the bottom line actually is that translating stuff is basically also team dynamics. So I actually mentioned time and time again, like, oh, you should do this as a group. This is how you do this by group. Ultimately, by the end of these kinds of translating into stories and the UX research, you have to be able to find a way to really onboard everyone to the same mindset and the same understanding, such that when they put things into the design, or when you start designing and ideating designs together, you really have like the same thing in mind as to what I wouldn't say like what needs to be there, but like what is the intention and what is the motivations, and really just crafting the experience, understanding your user to the best of your ability. So that's basically translating research into stories. Also actually be giving like a small additional thing also when it comes to UX research called documentation, but I think this is gonna be like 40 minutes already or something like that. So I'll try to make another video for you guys, but more or less this is all you need to know about translating UX research into stories. And that's all I have for you guys today. So I'm super excited to see what you guys have in store and hearing about your projects and stuff. So best of luck in your ex uni and go.